Welcome to Liberty Hall, everybody. This is the home of Joseph Smith III. We are celebrating the first day of our 45th season of sharing this historic site with the public. From April 1st until December 10th, we will be open for tours and other events from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Tuesday through Saturday. We are also happy to host tours or events outside of those regular hours as well. You can contact us at our mailing address, 1138 West Main Street in Lamoni, Iowa. Our email is libhall@grm.net, and our office phone, 641-784-6133, or our cell phone, actually my cell phone, 360-362-0585. My name is Steve Smith. I'm team lead here at Liberty Hall. And I would like to thank Barbara Walden and the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation for co-hosting this presentation. If you would like to support the work of Liberty Hall and the other Community of Christ historic sites, you can do so through the Historic Sites Foundation. And Barbara is dropping the Historic Sites Foundation donation link into the chats. Our presenter today is Wendy Eaton. Ms. Eaton is the administrative assistant for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, as well as the Joseph Smith Historic Site in Nauvoo, Illinois. She's been connected with the church historic sites since her first summer in Kirtland as an intern in 2006. She's a lifelong member of the Community of Christ and soon to be ordained as an elder. To date, she has recorded 10 episodes of the Project Zion podcast, Cup of Joe, which is a series of church history. Most of those focus on women's history in the Community of Christ. Her presentation today is titled, Be of Good Comfort, Emma, Bertha, and Ada. Because we are pre-recording this opportunity to submit questions live. If you have questions, please feel free to contact us at Liberty Hall, and we will try to get answers back to you. Now, here is Wendy. Wendy?
This venture started as a way to keep myself motivated during year 2 of the COVID shutdown of Joseph Smith Historic Site. I'd long wanted to bring voice to the women of Community of Christ history because it's largely been a story of men, even when women are telling the story. There was no better place to start than a partnership with Project Zion podcast, where they were wanting to highlight some women of church history as well. Karen Peter, the host, and I decided on Emmeline Griswold, Bertha Madison, and Ada Clark, distinct women in their own right who shared the same role as wife to President Joseph Smith III, though as we continuously emphasize, not at the same time. I'm quite pleased that I've been able to keep returning to sharing their stories and to keep researching more about them. There is so much more to their lives yet to be found and told. Emmeline Griswold was born 12 March 1838. She was the 9th of 11 children born to Elias and Lucinda Griswold. I've not yet found exactly why the Griswolds decided to move to Nauvoo, Illinois. I think it likely they were taking advantage of the affordable property after the Mormon Exodus. They were vocally opposed to the Latter-day Saints, an opposition that would cause Emmeline much stress in her marriage to Joseph. Elias purchased a lot here in 1857, but died in California not long after. Lucinda and her sons also purchased property in the fall of 1847. Lucinda was very active in the Methodist Church, and I wonder if she may have come into contact with Emma Smith, who married Louis Bideman in December of 1847 with the Methodist minister officiating. But this isn't a story about them. This is about Emmeline. Emmeline and Joseph first meet in a candy store. On their second meeting, Joseph asked if he could drive her home, and their courtship begins. Emmeline was one of the town beauties and had several suitors. Much later, in a 1914 letter to their daughter, Carrie, Joseph remarked about a recent visit Carrie had made to Nauvoo. He wrote, "Was much pleased at the way Philip Horton received you. He once shied a castor in the ring of attendant admirers of your mother, with Tom Kelly and 2 or 3 others, but I seem to have the lead in the contest." Their courtship is filled with buggy rides, church socials, and a singing school. In that same letter to Carrie, Joseph wrote about one evening after classes in that singing school that he encouraged the young men to offer to escort the young ladies home. But one of the young men would outright refuse, saying that he had attempted to ask to escort one of the ladies home, but she rebuked him. A friend whispered to Joseph that the scorned man had asked Emmeline, and she was courting Joseph at that time. So her attention was already very focused on Joseph. In the spring of 1857, Joseph asked Emmeline to marry him, but he asked her to think the matter over carefully before giving him an answer. He wasn't involved in religion at this time, but he knew it might someday be a major part of his life. He wrote in his memoirs, "I made her, Emmeline, this solemn promise, however, and assured her that she might rest securely upon it, that I would have nothing to do with either the teaching or the practicing of polygamy or plural marriage, for I regarded the doctrine as utterly false and repulsive." Emmeline took the full week to think over the matter. At the end of the week, they went for a long ride, and when he dropped her off at her mother's home, she assured Joseph that she understood his stipulations and she agreed to marry him. And there at her mother's door, they share their first kiss. During the engagement, Emmeline traveled to Minnesota to help her recently widowed brother-in-law with his children. While there, Emmeline begins receiving attention from local men. One man repulses her so much that she writes to Joseph, begging him to come rescue her. He does so, and they enjoy traveling the Mississippi River back to Nauvoo in one another's company. Emmeline and Joseph married on 22 October 1856, with only a neighbor girl and Reverend Waldenmeyer, the officiating Presbyterian minister, present. They made their first home on the Smith family farm just outside Nauvoo, eventually moving to the homestead. Not long after they settle, missionaries from out west pay a visit to Joseph and ask him to join their church. He's disinclined to accept, but it's a cordial visit. Not long after, they receive a much more dramatic pair of visitors. Samuel Gurley and Edmund Briggs arrived to find Emmeline home alone up at the farm. She welcomes them in to wait for Joseph's return, and when he does return, they present him with a letter from the Zarahemla Church. Briggs and Gurley all but demand Joseph return to Wisconsin with them. Emotions escalate, with Joseph and Briggs shouting at one another and Gurley in tears. Briggs would write of this moment in his autobiography, writing, "Joseph's wife said, 'Don't, Joseph, don't.' I will never forget those beautiful eyes as she looked up so imploringly to Joseph." Joseph then calmed down and said, "I do not mean to injure your feelings, and I ask your forgiveness." Brother Gurley also then asked forgiveness. The high emotions settled, peace resumed, and Emmeline proceeded to get dinner on the table. A daughter is born 28 July 1857, whom they name Emma Josepha, who's often referred to as Emma J. to distinguish her from her mother and grandmother. With her birth comes a change of home, the little family settling into the old homestead in the spring of 1858. The following year, a second daughter is born, Evelyn Rebecca. This bright-spirited baby died from a medical complication in the summer. Emmeline is heartbroken and distraught by the apparent stoicism of Joseph. Over the next few months, another major change affects their family. Joseph decides it's time to join that group from Zarahemla, now calling themselves the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm not surprised when in April of 1860, Emmeline does not go with Joseph to the Amboy Conference. She had a 2-year-old to care for, and we are well aware with Joseph writing how stormy it was crossing the Mississippi River to catch the train. I imagine that caused Emmeline to stop and think before making that trip with him. One of my favorite Emmeline stories happens early in their marriage over Christmas. When Joseph wrote the story down, he was in his later years and couldn't recall if it was their first or second Christmas. The little clues lead me to think it was their second. The year before, they had had a disastrous Thanksgiving. It was so bad that Emmeline refused to ever cook a whole turkey again. Joseph coaxes her to give another shot, purchases a turkey for them to fatten up in time for Christmas. He encourages to go to her mother, his mother, and a neighbor woman to get some hints on how to prepare another turkey. She does so, but she sets her foot down, saying that no one will attend this dinner except for her mother, his mother, and his stepfather. He helps her as much as he can, and they lay out a lovely Christmas dinner table. They all sit down, except for Joseph standing to carve the turkey. Emmeline is nearly in tears, mortified that the turkey would be just as tough as the one she had prepared the year before. But with tears of relief, the turkey was declared a triumph of cookery. After the guests leave, Joseph took Emmeline in his arms and congratulated her. He calls this his most pleasant Christmas memory. Emmeline is still navigating family strain as her mother still dislikes her marriage to Joseph. Their third child is born 13 September 1861, Carrie Lucinda, named for Emmeline's mother and a sister. After a visit to her mother's, Joseph arrives to take Emmeline, Emma J, and Carrie home. He finds his wife's face tear-stained. Friends of Lucinda had stopped by during the visit, and they had been quite critical of Joseph, telling Emmeline that he had turned Mormon and wasn't able to provide for her. In anger, Joseph says that Emmeline knew that someday he might join with the church. And then he says, you all also know that farmers have been struggling this year. Lucinda knew this, Emmeline knew this, and Joseph tells his mother-in-law that if she could not be supportive of he and Emmeline, then they were never visiting again. He turns to leave, and Emmeline hesitates, saying, oh, I don't know if it weren't for the little ones. He gives her 5 minutes to choose, him or her mother, and he walks out. He admits in his memoirs that this was cruel of him. In less than 5 minutes, Emmeline and the girls join him. 2 more children are born to the family, Zadie Viola on 25 April 1863 and Joseph Arthur on 12 October 1865. Joseph's travels increase and the church headquarters settles in Plano, Illinois, so they decide to move there as well in January of 1866. Emmeline is so homesick for Nauvoo that in March, she and baby Joseph travel back for a visit home. News reaches Joseph that the baby is sick. He hurries back to Nauvoo, but is too late. He arrives not long after baby Joseph had died. At some point during the baby's illness, Emmeline asked her brother-in-law, David, to baptize her. In 1867, church business in Iowa allows for Emmeline to take her 3 eldest daughters to Nauvoo to visit family while Joseph works. The eldest, Emma J., contracts pneumonia, and her grandmother Lucinda wants to call a doctor. Joseph is hesitant, but having matured since his last argument with his mother-in-law, he agrees to call the doctor in the morning. But first he calls his brother and another elder to offer a prayer of administration for the girl. In the morning, Emma J. is better, and the relationship between Lucinda and Joseph finally begins to heal. At last, Emmeline is seeing harmony between her mother and her husband. Emmeline relates a dream she had to Joseph. They were riding together, but in separate vehicles. They become separated by a river, Emmeline on one side, Joseph on the other, and Emmeline cannot pass. The dream left a great impression on her. She became pregnant once more, but lost the son. Joseph recognizes what Emmeline seems to know. Her life is drawing to an end. Help is needed to keep the girls cared for and to help Emmeline be tended. A young woman named Bertha Madison pays a visit, and Emmeline takes to her immediately. Bertha lived in the home for Emmeline's last 3 months. Joseph hardly left Emmeline's side. She died 25 March 1869. Joseph took her body back to Nauvoo to be buried next to Evelyn and Joseph in God's little acre next to the old homestead. Her surviving daughters, 11-year-old Emma J., 7-year-old Carrie, and nearly 6-year-old Zadie, remain in Bertha's care while Joseph tries to figure out what his family most needs. Here you see an image of the second home that Emmeline and Joseph shared, the old homestead. And that's where I'm recording today. So if you see that in the background. And then this is an image of the home in Plano that Emmeline and Joseph shared. 3 of Emmeline's children lived to adulthood. Emma J. had 4 sons and lived to 1940. Carrie had 1 daughter and lived to 1944. Zadie was frail as her mother was, and she only lived to 1891, dying after complications from the birth of her 4th child. Bertha Madison was born 16 July 1843 to Norwegian immigrant parents Mads and Mary. She was the second eldest of their 8 children. An intelligent child, Bertha was drawn to nature. Her father's wanderlust led the family to move several times, including to the dense forest of southeast Minnesota for a time. When Bertha is 16, she decides to focus on her education, boarding with a family in Waterloo, Iowa, where her older sister, who's now married, lived. The sisters are alarmed at first when they learn that their father has joined the RLDS church. But as they begin to understand the religion, their anxiety is relieved, and soon they also join. Bertha is baptized in May 1865. 4 years later, she's living in the church president's home, caring for his frail wife. After Emmeline dies, while Joseph is taking her remains to Nauvoo, Bertha takes the little Smith girls to Mission, Illinois, and her parents' home. When Joseph returns to Plano, Mark and Elizabeth Forscott move into the Smith home with Joseph, his daughters, and Bertha. This causes gossip to stir in the community, the scandal of an unmarried woman living in the church president's home. The rumors become so vicious that Joseph returns home to find Bertha in tears at least on one occasion. He describes in his memoirs taking this problem to prayer. And the solution that comes to him is to marry again. And to him, Bertha is a woman of good character, intelligence, ingenuity, and more important, she cares for his daughters, and they like her. He proposes, and they are married 12 November 1869. Sadly, this does not squash the negative comments. Joseph wrote in his memoirs, "I had married my wife for myself and not for my neighbors or for the church, and that if I were satisfied, they had no reason to be otherwise." Bertha's love and care were a boon to Carrie and Zadie, but Emma J. had a harder time adjusting. Eventually, a solution is found by allowing her to stay with her grandma Emma in Nauvoo for long periods of time. She kept in touch with letters home, hearing all the news from Plano, particularly all the new babies. Bertha and Joseph would grow the family with 9 children: David, Audentia, Fred, Israel, Kenneth, Azuba, Hale, Blossom, and Lucy. Kenneth and Blossom both die in infancy. With the expansion of railway travel in the United States and a very capable wife at home, Joseph's travel increases, and family letters give all sorts of insight to the activity in Bertha's home. She clearly taught her children to read and write as early as possible. One letter to Fred sent to his father was from when the future president was about 2 years old. It was just a few little words, but still pretty impressive. Audentia also had many letters written to her father, and she retained many of these letters and memories and shared them in the Autumn Leaves magazine. And so we have a treasure trove of Smith family stories from Audentia. In 1880, plans were being made for the Smiths to move to Lamoni, Iowa, the church's new headquarters. Bertha and Joseph carefully designed their new home to be spacious enough for their large family and still have plenty of room to entertain guests. In October 1881, though the house is not quite ready for them, they make the move. They plan to stay with Brother Banta's family until Liberty Hall is ready for them. A storm is brewing on the horizon when it's time to return to Brother Banta's after a day of cleaning and unpacking. Bertha urges Joseph to take the boys, David, Frederick, and Israel, back to the Bantas, but she, Audentia, Azuba, and baby Hale are going to stay in Liberty Hall. Bertha wants to keep an eye on the home through the storm, in particular her newly settled chickens. As night fell, she made up a couple of beds on the floor and tucked the children in. During the night, Audentia wrote later in life, her mother woke her up. Audentia writes, "Audie, come, I just want you to see this water." And taking me to the side door where we could see the water pouring out of the spout, which later supplied a large cistern, we stood and watched, fascinated, the force and volume of the stream ejected. "Why, that's strong enough to turn a mill wheel," I remember Mother remarking. The lightnings cut their way constantly through the clouds, and the thunder roared and crashed about our ears. Never had I seen or heard the elements in such commotion. And as I clung close to her, all I could note of her reaction to the storm was a sort of fierce delight, an attunement which seemed to fill her with pleasure. Drenched to the skin from her frequent sallies out to the tubs, she just laughed in the pure joy the experience had awakened in her. This elemental quality about Mother, born of her love for nature and her early contacts with its primitive and varied expression, delivered her of any emotion of fear. Just a few minutes walk east from Liberty Hall is Rose Hill Cemetery, where Bertha would eventually be buried near her parents and 3 of her children. Blossom, as I mentioned, died in infancy. Just over a year after her death, their daughter Azuba died as a result of a playground accident. And not long after that, in January 1886, their eldest son, David, died. He had never been a strong child, and his last recorded words were spoken to his mother, "Mama, you've been so good to me." I wish I had time to tell all the great farming tales of Bertha. She had quite the talent for fostering life, both plant and animal. She kept chickens, horses, cows, and pigs. She grew tomatoes, yams, apples, and peaches. Baskets of her produce and jars of her preserves found their way to the tables of those in need. Bertha was attending to business in early September 1896 when she's thrown from the wagon she was driving. She's stunned but recovers. A few weeks later, stubbornly determined to drive that same team of spirited horses, she is once again thrown. She's put to bed where she remains for about 2 weeks. She insists Joseph go back to his business. 16-year-old Hale and 12-year-old Lucy are home and quite capable of helping out. Audentia and Carrie, both married, live close by in Lamoni and can also help out. With the comfort of knowing so many family members are there to assist, Joseph resumes his travels, but doesn't go far away. He's back home on the 19th of October when he hears Lucy calling for help. Bertha had tried to rise from bed, but had fallen. Father and daughter managed to get Bertha back into bed, tuck her in, and Joseph takes her hand. Bertha turned her face to his and breathed his last. Joseph expressed his grief in his memoirs. I did not think she could die. Audentia and her family move into Liberty Hall to try to ease the enormous void left by Bertha. In 1897, Joseph wrote a letter to his son, Fred, newly married or soon to be, the date's a little hard to make out, saying, I may not marry again, though I am at times very lonely since your mother died. I may marry if I meet with a suitable companion. It's a question for the future, but I'm growing old. He would soon meet a suitable companion not long after this letter, or perhaps right around the time he was writing this letter, and this was how he was letting Fred know. Here you see the lovely Liberty Hall home, designed by Bertha and Joseph, and of course, Bertha's conservatory. 5 of Bertha's 9 children lived to adulthood. Audentia lived the longest, dying in 1863. She had 7 children. Fred died in 1946, Israel in 1958, and Hale in 1956, each having 2 children. Her youngest, Lucy, lived to 1945 and had 5 children. Ada Rachel Clark was born 23 July 1871 in Garafraxa, Ontario, to Alexander and Mary Clark. The Clark family were active in their local congregation, Ada serving as one of the primary organists. Our LDS missionary, R.C. Evans, visits the community in 1893, and the family attend one of his meetings. Captivated by his message, the Clarks decide to be baptized. Ada and Joseph establish a friendship quickly when he's in Toronto for the church conference in the early fall of 1897. He has duties in the eastern United States, but promises Ada that he would return for Christmas. In the meantime, he writes letters home, and it's pretty clear what his future hopes are now. To his daughter Audentia, he writes describing a tall, intelligent, musical woman with dark hair and gray eyes, whom he's had the pleasure of walking home. To Carrie and Emma, he wrote, my dear daughters, I've decided to again marry. Ada's parents were hesitant to give their blessing for their 26-year-old daughter to marry the 65-year-old Joseph, but Ada was in love and knew who she wanted to share her life with. Ada was prepared to step into the very public role as wife to the president of the church and step into an incredibly large family. Joseph's oldest daughter, Emma and Carrie, were both older than Ada and were married and had children. Fred, Israel, and Audentia were right about Ada's own age. Hale and Lucy were teenagers, the only 2 at home. And I think Joseph had about 12 grandchildren at this time. Ada and Joseph are married 12 January 1898 in her parents' home by R.C. Evans. He wrote of the event to the Saints Herald, saying, President Smith was attired in a clerical black suit. Sister Clark was dressed in well, I really can't tell you how she was dressed. Oh, for a woman's power to describe. But she looked sweet and pretty, the picture of health and happiness. The groom was assisted by Brother Archibald McLean of the city of Toronto, the bride by her sister, Alice Clark. The supper was both artistic and substantial. From the highest story of the bride's cake was seen the emblems of the two greatest nations on earth, the Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack. May this miniature annexation be but the prophecy of the greater which shall link together all America. Ada settles into her new home and new life, but she's not immediately confined to roles that keep her home. She's free to travel with Joseph and by herself, and she does so. Within the first few months of their marriage, she travels with him to the spring conference in Independence, Missouri. Early in the summer, she travels alone back to Toronto for a sister's wedding. And then in the summer, she returns to the United States to attend reunions with Joseph. One of the favorite stories of Ada takes place at the end of their first year of marriage. Joseph rides out from Liberty Hall in his bell-strung sleigh on Christmas Day to bring friends over for dinner, friends who would have otherwise been alone. The following day, Ada's firstborn child arrives, Richard Clark. They would have two more sons, William Wallace, born in 1900, and Reginald Archer, born in 1903. These three rowdy boys do cause Ada to need to adjust how often she travels with Joseph, but she does keep traveling with him and proves herself to be a crucial companion to keep him working through his later years. At times, they leave the boys with their elder siblings. They have a particularly close relationship with their sister Lucy, and at times they leave them with church friends. In the summer of 1905, however, they decide to turn Joseph's extensive travels in the Western United States into a family vacation. Ada's parents have moved to Vancouver, and she has a sister living in Idaho. And so in early July, they leave Liberty Hall and board a train heading west for a very long vacation. There are some great stories Ada shares of this trip, writing in many letters to Lucy. Just a few of the capers the boys get into. The youngest, Reginald, gets into his aunt's garden and ate so many raw peas that he became incredibly sick. Not long after, he wanders away from his parents during a reunion. He's lost for an hour before being found safely. Then while visiting the Oregon State Fair, Richard wanders off, only to be found later in the company of constables. I think William was the only one that Ada did not have to report mischief on. In the fall, they make their way to Salt Lake City, where Joseph's son, Frederick, is employed in church business. It's decided that Joseph needs to make this an extended stay, but the boys are proving a challenge. Joseph writes, perhaps it should have been recorded here earlier that in consultation with my wife after a few days sojourn in Salt Lake City, we deemed it wise for her to go home with the children, who were pretty lively charges. Ada and the boys return to Lamoni on October 4th, and Joseph stays a little over a month longer. The strain of this trip takes a toll on Joseph's health, so that he and Ada decide to downsize to a smaller home in Lamoni. Then the following year, 1906, they move to Independence, where Joseph is finally settling church headquarters. His workload is lightened a little more each year, and he now never travels alone. Joseph falls in June 1914, Writing to daughter Carrie, he says, Ada is taking good care of me, doctoring me with camphor and oil. His life winds to a close on 10 December 1914 with Ada by his side. 3 months after his death, Ada writes to Lucy, Carrie, and Carrie's daughter, "You, to each one of you, I am indebted for precious lives of good cheer and news." Ada was thankful to her large family for their love and support during this time of transition for her and the boys. She had built a little family altar in the home and encouraged the boys to each take a turn leading family prayer. They all missed Joseph's presence in their lives. Family members are living in the area, and especially Audentia and Israel are regularly in the home to help. Ada wrote that she is determined to resume her activities of caring for those less fortunate. Her own health is not good, though. For 2 years, she had been living with a malignant goiter, which became much worse in the spring of 1915. Her sister Mabel and Joseph's eldest daughter Emma move into the home so that someone is always with the boys and someone is always with Ada, who is often in the church hospital. Fred and Israel regularly visit Ada in the hospital as well, and Mabel writes to extended family, keeping them up to date on the most current news. To Carrie, she wrote that she did not expect Ada to live much longer. Hearing this, Lucy writes to Mabel expressing her concern about her brothers, saying that she will come and get them if need be. Mabel writes to Lucy, "Your beautiful concern about the welfare of the boys touched my heart very deeply, and I can never put into words the gratitude I feel that they have found a place in your heart so dear. I truly hope it will not be a problem we will have to solve." Unfortunately, Ada does not recover. She died on 20 October 1915, 10 months and 10 days after her husband. She's buried beside him in Mound Grove Cemetery in Independence, Missouri. Her boys are still young. Richard's nearly 17, William nearly 15, and Reginald 12. It's not Lucy who takes them in, but Israel and his wife Nina, who move into the Smith home to take care of the boys. A dear friend and fellow member of the Stone Church, Abby Horton, wrote of Ada, "She paused to comfort them who feared the storm and stress. Where sorrow was, she left the glow of sturdy cheerfulness." This is an image of that last home of Ada and Joseph, located not far from what we would recognize as church headquarters today in Independence. And the other photo you see, the extended family of Joseph. He's seated in the middle with Ada and White on his side. All three of Ada's boys lived to adulthood. Richard lived to 1969 and had 3 children. William lived to 1989, also having 3 children, and Reginald lived to 1979. Emmeline, Bertha, and Ada, 3 remarkable women whose care, companionship, and love supported Joseph Smith III through his life and ministry. As he dictated in his memoirs, writing, "As I have said, I loved my first wife with the ardent love usually cherished by young and domestically inclined men for the companions they have chosen out of the world. In a little over 12 years of married happiness, her life was snuffed out, and she was laid to rest near the flowing Mississippi in Nauvoo. My life with my second companion was a very pleasant, placid, and happy one, and continued for 27 years with our mutual marital regard and esteemed undisturbed and unbroken to the last. When her strong, robust life was cut short by an untoward accident, I married this, my third companion, for the purpose of keeping my home intact and preserving that domestic environment which has been ever essential to my happiness." I hope you now feel better acquainted with these 3 beyond these lines that Joseph dictated for his memoirs. Emmeline was his first love. and she was gentle and patient and a loving partner. Bertha was his pleasant companion. She was strong, intelligent, and industrious. Ada was his compassionate caretaker, and she was the one who would help keep him working to his last days. We owe them so much for our identity as members of Community of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, for sharing those fascinating stories of Joseph Smith III's 3 consecutive wives, Emma, Bertha, and Ada. You brought those ladies to life for us. And as we try to understand their times and lives, that's very helpful. We share our thanks to you, our friends, for joining us in learning more about the history of Liberty Hall Historic Site in Lamoni, Iowa. If you'll be traveling in the Lamoni area, we invite you to stop by Liberty Hall. We would love to share the history of this place with you, give you a tour through the home and the school, or just talk. And thanks to you all for supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites. And thank you and have a blessed day.